Hello and thanks for watching this Life Solved short. I'm Robyn Montague, and in these videos we get to meet the University of Portsmouth researchers sharing their work in the latest series of the Life Solved podcast. This is work that's changing our world for the better in all sorts of ways. This time I'm joined by Dr. Megan Hoffman, course administrator at the School of Art Design and Performance, and Dr. Simon Hobbs, senior lecturer at the University of Portsmouth. Together we'll take a look at true crime online, from TikTok to podcasts, and how the medium can be used for good and for bad. So Megan and Simon, thank you so much for joining me today to chat about this. Really interesting conversation, I think, and hopefully we'll learn a lot about how to be better consumers of true crime. So we just mentioned there the case of Nicola Bulley. Quite a few people will know about that, and if you don't, it's definitely worth a search because the coverage of that was, I suppose it's fair to say, quite shocking for a lot of people. And we became increasingly aware, for good and for bad, about how social media has an impact on these sort of cases. So can you give us a little bit of background about the case and why we were quite surprised by how it was covered?
Yeah, what happened with the Nicola Bulley case was in January of this year in Lancashire, a woman went missing while walking her dog. And it happened that this case got a great deal of media coverage. And from that coverage by the traditional media, a lot of social media sort of amateur sleuths started also investigating the case for themselves. On TikTok in particular, some people actually went to the area where they were looking for her body, and they are sort of carrying out their own investigations. And this was obviously very harmful because they had nothing to do with the case. They had nothing to do with the police. Both the family, Nicola Bulley's family, and the police released statements condemning this sort of social media sleuthing. But it kind of didn't stop people. And eventually even TikTok released a statement, an anti-bullying and harassment statement about the kind of social media coverage that this case was getting.
You know, armchair detectives have been a thing for, all through the history of true crime, and has always been part of why people like to consume true crime. But what we have here is a real kind of enacting of that and going beyond the armchair, basically. Plenty of the reports on it will talk about armchair detectives getting out of the armchair and visiting the site, and but also not just that, you get the spread of kind of misinformation, conspiracy theories, guesswork, which during a live case can be hugely damaging, not only to the police efforts, but also the family and loved ones and anyone involved or who knew the person, regardless of who that is. And with a case such as Nicola Bulley, which really kind of blew up in more ways than one, both in traditional media and on social media, those kind of impacts can be really broadly felt and quite harmful to all involved, really. So it was a real moment, I think, in kind of TikTok sleuthing, although not the first one. We've seen it in America as well.
Yeah, I even think that probably the huge blow up around the Nicola Bulley case was influenced by the Gabby Petito case in America. It was the case of a woman who is sort of like an Instagram influencer, like a van life influencer, who went missing. I think it was last year or the year before. And that kind of had a similar blow up. And because she herself was an Instagrammer, people were sort of poring over her Instagram account and saying, "Ooh, I see a clue here. I see a clue here." Not necessarily helping with the case, but just trying to partake in the excitement of this investigation around her very sad murder.
I remember that case actually, and you mentioned there about the armchair detectives. That takes me back, and this just jumped into my head, but that documentary on Netflix, I think it was Netflix, Don't F with Cats.
Yes.
So that's, obviously it's not involving humans, so maybe people are a bit more open to the idea of these people getting behind the case, trying to find clues and support it. Whereas, like we've just said, Nicola Bulley and the one that you mentioned in America, these are humans, this is a very sensitive subject. So a lot of people would be shocked to know that people were actually going down to the crime scene, which was an open investigation. You also had journalists from different organizations going down and doing walkthroughs on their TikTok pages. So who influenced who,
Exactly.
The different ways in which missing people's cases are covered is startling, really. there's obviously missing white women syndrome. So that plays into account of which stories get picked up, whose stories get picked up. We have, a series of people from minority groups going missing. We have men, of course, hugely at risk in certain age groups of going missing and never getting this kind of coverage. Coverage goes from kind of awareness and useful amounts of coverage to like voyeurism. And I think the Nicola Bulley case tipped over there. The thing about, I guess, TikTok and other social media pages is they can only really drive interest. It's like a community in a shadow economy almost that feeds from the mainstream. So if no one was reporting on the case, then no one else would watch it. These TikTok sleuths, they kind of become viral or popular because of mainstream interest. Now mainstream interest can only really be provided by the mainstream media. So and as we might talk about later on, there's been any cases on TikTok that are covered with just as much passion or care, or are just as intriguing, for want of a better word, that don't get picked up on because the media itself doesn't. So traditional journalists, newspapers, news reports, they're the driving force, really, I think.
And you said their interest. So even before the internet and, the access to these platforms that are sharing this content, crime-based books, TV, and just word of mouth, people have always been fairly interested in the macabre. I think it's fair to say. So why do you think that is? Why are we so drawn to these kind of stories?
I think it's been really interesting, some of the research that's been done about who is actually consuming true crime. Overwhelmingly, statistically speaking, the audience for true crime is women. Back in the 80s, there was a study done. Over 80% of the true crime magazine audience was women. In 2018, and a study was done, over 70% of the true crime podcast audience is women. So I think it's really interesting to look at this and to look at who is consuming it. And that obviously also feeds into who these stories are about. And I think particularly with more recent true crime, but obviously also with true crime in the past, these stories are about women. They're about dead women. They're about women getting murdered, which is quite interesting because the more likely murder victims statistically are men. They're young men of color, and women are far less likely to get murdered than young men of color. And I think perhaps the true crime audience feeds into who is actually getting depicted in these true crime outputs. And that says something interesting about our society and about our society's attitudes to women and about misogyny. And women are watching these things and they're thinking, oh, I should be afraid, because one of the main motivators, I think this 2018 study found, was that women were watching true crime and consuming true crime. One of their primary motivators was to avoid becoming victims themselves. And so true crime that's being produced really sort of reinforces this fear, and it sort of perpetuates this fear as well.
Which is particularly interesting in what we found in our work in the age, but in a post-Me Too age. So we have a raising awareness and an increased awareness of female victimhood, and an increased care of speaking about that and providing safe spaces for victims of sexual and domestic abuse. But also we have a whole industry built around perpetuating those images, exploiting those images potentially. So we have this kind of move towards recognition, awareness, help, and equally in the media we have a move towards repeating these stories again and again, fetishizing the body again and again. So that's absolutely crucial to this kind of quite unique time. I mean, it did happen. It has happened in the past in terms of kind of women's rights movements being met with a rise of kind of violent media against women as well, and this kind of balancing act. We see it in the kind of late 60s, early 70s. But our work is really focused on this kind of contemporary period that we're currently living through.
But they're not easy to research. And I suppose that's a key fear for a lot of people when they think of true crime on social media and stuff. It's amateur. So when they think of amateur, they automatically think it's not well researched. It hasn't got that credibility that, say, a newspaper article or official podcast producer would have. But is that always the case? Do you find that when you're watching these amateur true crime series online or on platforms that they aren't up to the same calibre?
It's tricky. I mean, certainly there are cases where, of course, things are not, stories are not researched enough, and there's or stories are told without permission, or will rely on stuff like Wikipedia or Reddit posts and misinformation or hearsay. There's obviously cases of that, but that comes from some of the biggest podcasts around. So that's not just the kind of amateurs. Those are these kind of professional podcasters who rely on that information. I think what's important is, or what we think is important, is that amateur can both mean, as you say, the negative of the word amateur, but it can also mean marginal, maybe. So what we hear from our voices that maybe don't, that we, not only do we not hear certain stories in the mainstream, we don't hear certain voices in the mainstream, we don't hear certain people in the mainstream. So what we found is that social media, particularly TikTok, but also potentially podcasts, have become a space for people of colour to be able to tell their stories that they don't see represented elsewhere. Indigenous people, particularly from the Americas, being able to speak about the kind of the crime that's placed upon them. Survivors as well, who might not have the means in which to, start a professional podcast, or might not feel safe doing so, but can, easily access TikTok and tell their stories. And certainly in many cases tell stories that have been told by others, but take it on themselves. So I think, of course, like anything, you have the bad and the negative side, and that's often what's covered. But I think equally you have, with amateur content, with low threshold content, you have opportunity for others to be able to have their stories heard, their voices heard, themselves represented.
And are there any examples of where someone, you've said there about victims using the platform as an opportunity, or a platform as an opportunity to talk about their own stories, possibly reach out to others who have experienced similar things and build a community or a safe space? Have there been any examples of accounts that you've looked at that have actually done that really well?
Yeah, there are a couple of really good examples on TikTok of that, actually. There's Sarah Turney, who is a woman whose sister, Alyssa, was murdered by their father. And the case just sort of got dropped by the police. It wasn't being investigated. So Sarah Turney took to TikTok and she drummed up loads of interest for the case. She got herself 1 million followers. And it ended up being that she got so much renewed interest in reopening the case that the police did reopen the case, and they did charge her father with the murder. And he's currently being tried this year. So that's an example of somewhere where the family member of a victim really got concrete action. And something else that she's done is she's sort of like parlayed her TikTok fame into becoming a true crime influencer for good, as it were. And so now she uses all her followers and all her cachet to advocate for cases that maybe aren't getting the attention and don't have the family members who are as social media savvy as she is. And she tries to help, which is amazing. And she advocates for sort of an ethical true crime consumption. She doesn't hate the genre. She doesn't reject the genre, but she wants the genre to be used for good.
Thank you both so much for chatting with me today. It's been absolutely fascinating. It's unlikely that the creators of TikTok, Facebook, or even podcasts like Life Solved could ever have imagined how their platforms might be used for bad, but hopefully more for good. And we're starting to see that more often, especially in the world of true crime. If you'd like to find out more about how social media and podcasts are being used to help solve crimes and often support and advise victims, listen to the full episode of Life Solved on the University of Portsmouth website or on your favourite podcast app now. You can click the link in the comments box below or head to port.ac.uk/research. Next week, we carry on the crime conversation, but instead of looking at citizen policing, we examine the organisations and people tasked with policing the police themselves. See you again next time.